everyone. My name's Lynn. I am the Development Director at Mayday Trust. For those of you who haven't heard of Mayday before, can you all hear me, by the way? Is it yeah. We're an organisation that works with people going through some of the toughest life transitions, so people experiencing homelessness, coming out of prison, leaving care or psychiatric hospital. And we've been going for about 40 years. And up until about 7 years ago, we were a very traditional housing-related support provider, so still delivering key work to people in our accommodation. But in 2011, we did something we'd never really done before. We carried out a deep listening inquiry with the people that we were working with to hear what they thought about the homelessness services that they were receiving. And from this, two main things really screamed out to us. I think the first one was that the process that people had to go through when they became homeless was at best dehumanising due to all the needs of risk assessments that people had to go through. And at worst, it was institutionalising. We were seeing so many people becoming trapped in that kind of cycle of dependence in services that were actually designed to support them. And secondly, the outcomes just weren't good enough. We saw so many people coming back into our services, unable to move on because they hadn't really created any friends or any life outside of this kind of homeless identity. I mean, this scream, it really was too loud for us to ignore, so we started researching externally as to what worked. And this wasn't really within the homelessness sector, this was more broadly looking at research from Harvard executive coaching and psychology about how you build internal motivation. And what this told us was that focusing on weakness and needs only gets you limited results, whereas when we focus on strengths, sustainable lasting change is actually possible. That the fixing doesn't work. It focuses on the problem, not the person, and reinforces a sense of failure. When we're more person-centred, those barriers are removed, and it allows people to take positive risks so they can grow their ability for change themselves. And also that segregation is really harmful. And I think as a sector, we've all created this homeless industry really that separates people from their communities. And we'll see homeless GPs, homeless art classes, there's now homeless apps. And actually when we spend time and money then investing into trying to get people back into the community when really we probably shouldn't have taken them out in the first place. So we captured these, and this is all what we call the wisdom from the street, and this was really powerful. And as an organisation, we knew that actually tinkering around the edges of what we did just wasn't going to be enough. So we took the decision to completely go back to wood. We threw out our old way of working, we stopped key working, we ditched all of our paperwork and started to co-design a new approach that was very person-led, not process-led. So with the staff and people that we worked with, we got rid of the key working and instead brought in what we call inspirational asset coaching that passed power back to people. So it's looking more at people's strengths, aspirations, their assets as the key driver for change. We stopped referring people into services just as a habit, but instead started brokering opportunities in people's communities based on their talents and interests, so that they could start to create a new identity, a new narrative, and develop networks and friends outside of the homeless community. So we call this a personal transition service. The aim being that people could start to transition out of their situations quickly and have access to the right intervention at the right time, so it's no longer just about those siloed problems. But what we hadn't banked on when we did this was the enormous ripple effect that this had on our whole organisation. All of our processes, policies, paperwork, all of it had to change internally to reflect the real-world nature of people's lives, and we have that move away from that deficit-based focus. Our measurement tools and our approach to capturing information changed to move away from deficit captures such as outcome stars towards more measuring people's strengths and assets. So we adapted a tool from the US that could empirically capture asset development, which has been really interesting for us to test. We talked a bit about culture earlier, and our culture had to shift so hugely when we passed that power back to people. This included our language, our structure, environment, processes, and most importantly, our people. We found that delivering in this way required people that were naturally able to give their power away and to facilitate rather than fix and allow people to flourish and fail. So at this point we re-interviewed all of our staff into these new roles, and we actually lost 50% of our workforce at that time. People either didn't want to do it, or they didn't have the right internal mindset and behaviours for this way of working. Our governance was tested to the limit, and I think we required our board to really buy into our vision, and they really did get behind us to support us on the kind of rocky ride ahead that we had. We were lucky enough to have a very trusting commissioner in one area that we worked with that allowed us to vary our contract to work just to outcome instead of output, to test the impact of the personal transition service. And we also brought on board new investment to test the PTS in a new area as a kind of bigger proof of concept. When we got to the point where our results were kind of significant enough to feel confident that we could actually take our way of working out to the sector. So we chose not to grow Mayday Trust, but instead to grow the model through what we call innovation partners, to scale the intervention, and so it had a real kind of locally grounded impact, and actually changing lives of Becky, one of the PTS partners as well. And we also created an accreditation, and the reason we did that is because you always hear that people are working in a different way. You get the, yeah, we're doing that effect. When you talk about kind of personalisation, it's kind of like, well, we took people canoeing, and it's not really what we mean by that. Actually, what we wanted to do is look at how do you really evidence where people are really buying into that culture change, and actually looking to change something bigger than just themselves to win contracts. So not only did this have a huge impact on us internally, I think one of the biggest things as well was where we could and then where we would go for funding. We got to the point where traditional funding approaches just weren't reflecting or supporting the realities or aspirations of the people that we were working with. So with the support of our board, we agreed to be 100% committed to our vision of being person-led, and this brought about some really difficult decisions that we had to make. We moved away from two of our main commissioning areas, one where we were founded 40 years ago. And in one of these areas, we spent a long time talking to the commissioners there, and we found that they didn't get it, they didn't want to do it, and despite any feedback or evidence, just weren't interested. And that's fine, that's fair enough, but we made the decision to leave. And in the other area, we had commissioners that really bought into the PTS. They varied the contract, we got to pilot and test it. But when it came to the tendering exercise, we didn't score highly enough because the tender spec hadn't changed. And so there was the insistence on things like engagement policies, that we had to enforce house rules for the people that were in our accommodation, and just various other restrictive outputs that just really weren't what we were about at all. And it was quite ironic, they said then that they were more surprised than we were that we weren't successful. They were keen to work with us, loved the approach, but their words were, we needed a bridge to get to you. And I always found that a really interesting feedback, and I think it was just that, it just hit me, it's not just about providers and organisations, it's about we all need to be in this together. It's not just about a new intervention, you really need to start looking at that wider change. So as a result of this, we halved the size of our organisation, choosing not to survive for survival's sake and accept money that drifted our mission, but to really stick to our guns and grow our approach through the network and as a kind of movement for change. Funding-wise, we opted instead to work with commissioners and funders that were willing to work in this new way, and sought funding from some progressive trusts that allowed us to innovate and learn alongside them. Funders and commissioners that were really genuinely curious as to how this approach could make a difference to the lives of people that we were working with. We also brought on a social impact bond, which is something we hadn't done before. And our social impact bond is the first SIB for homelessness where the local authority is the key outcome payer. So it's backed by bridges, and what this allowed us to do was to really do that working towards an outcome, not the output, and really strip back that need for the blanket and restrictive policies and processes. So we've been running this for over a year, and I think one of the things that's really stood out to us is how we're able to really deep dive into the measurements and work alongside to kind of change rate cards if necessary, and really look behind what those outcomes mean rather than just ticking the box to say you've done it. Last year we began working in a new area in Westminster, and we were commissioned there to deliver a kind of housing-related support contract. And this was so different, I think, to how we've worked before. We worked quite closely with the commissioners beforehand. They were interested in the work that we did. And when the tender spec came out, I don't think I've ever actually been so excited to read a tender spec. It was actually a joy to read rather than kind of, how can I make that fit? And it really was about how an organisation can deliver that right intervention at the right time for people, but it was open enough to allow that kind of scope for the messy nature of the kind of personalised work that we were doing. And I think that realisation was that you can't deliver any kind of personalised strength-based work in a deficit-based contract. But the main thing for me has been that the relationship has been one of openness, honesty, listening, reflection, learning together, but the willingness to flex and change and adapt as we've started to learn. And I think this thing hasn't really been plain sailing. That all sounds very kind of, this has all been great. We've also had experiences of being brought in as the new innovation, not having backing of the commissioners when things have got difficult, opting instead to focus on contract compliance rather than listening and kind of adapting to the real world situations. We've seen 100% staff turnovers in some of the areas we've worked with, where our approach has been brought in and people have seen it as either kind of potentially threatening or suspicious, referred to it as fluffy at best and risky and unprofessional at worst. This is when it was a bit of a head in our hands moment, really. We thought, oh God, this is terrible, this is failing. And it was only when we spoke to our partners at Lankenny Chase Foundation, they said, actually, you're not failing. What's happening is you're trying to deliver a person-led kind of practice within a system that's very deficit-based. So you're bashing up against that system, and this is the kind of, it can have a real impact on the front line. And what we mean by that, and this is hopefully a little bit nicer than the obesity one, when we're looking at what we think for the deficit system and what that means, it's really one that it's very much led by the state as to where we kind of obviously pull down that funding into silos. We were talking on our table a little bit there about how providers are constantly having to gain for resources, and actually all you're doing in that is trying to get this kind of quite meaningless data sometimes just to justify that expenditure. Service delivery can be quite prescriptive and really around fixing rather than letting people kind of do what they need to do. And what happens is you have a person quite segregated from this process, and they're almost kind of shut out of that as a kind of recipient of it rather than it being about them. So what we're looking at is what we've called a transition system. And this is characterised more about giving control to the person so that we can kind of trust them to know what's best. Listening, understanding, having an awareness that removing people from community and that sense of purpose really takes away their identity and impacts on their ability to get through their tough times. And again, this is really about having that more equal relationship between funders and other stakeholders, and that understanding that we can all get things wrong, and if we all go in it together, that we're probably more likely to have more success. So our experience has shown really that for that kind of strength-based work to work and embed and to actually be successful, one of the key things is about having that strength-based contract that looks about how people can transition as they see fit, to really build on their strengths and aspirations rather than just fixing what we think works. It also requires a big change of power dynamic, and we spend a lot of time looking at that power dynamic between the staff and the people they work with, but actually this is more about how we change that power dynamic between everybody, so like funders and commissioners moving away from that kind of potential master and servant relationship to something that's really quite genuinely all in it together. I mean, we found for the work that we do, that focus on outcome and not output has been really impactful. And also looking at how we can share the pressures that none of us can change. There's, again, on our table, we're looking at, there are some things that actually commissioners don't have any control of, and you can't move those, but having that joint understanding has been really quite eye-opening for us as a provider to go through. Looking at measuring assets has been quite a good thing. We've really challenged what data we keep and why we keep it. We're looking at things like reduction in substance misuse, reduction in offending, and actually what we don't do is talk to people about that. If they disclose it, we will capture it and look at, well, what does that mean to that person, rather than having to answer the question to tick a box. And I think there's something about that real reflection on whether it's something you really want, because this really isn't an easy way of doing things. We always have this phrase that we use that I'm sure in 3 months everything will settle down, and it's kind of become a bit akin to next year, Rodney, we're all going to be millionaires. It's just not going to happen. And I think when you're working in this way, when you're actually delivering stuff that works for people, it's always going to be messy. It's always going to be really chaotic, and it's about how do we all get together to really embrace that mess and try and create something that works for the individual and doesn't just make us really comfortable.
Thank you.